Deep in the Amazon rainforest, where the canopy blocks out the sky and shadows move like living things, hunters tell stories about footprints that lead nowhere. Fresh tracks pressed into the mud, heading deeper into the jungle, yet somehow walking away from whatever made them. Some say it's a trick of the light, others blame the rain, but the indigenous people of Brazil know better. They know about the Curupira. They know about the feet that face the wrong way. Picture this. You're tracking an animal through dense Brazilian forest. The sun filters through leaves in scattered coins of light. You find footprints, human-sized, toes pointed clearly toward the heart of the jungle. You follow. Hours pass. The prints stay fresh, stay clear, always ahead of you. But something feels wrong. The forest has gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just your breathing and the sound of your own footsteps on wet earth. And then you realize it. You're going in circles. You've been walking deeper into the forest. But the footprints you're following, they were walking out. The feet were backward. You weren't tracking something. Something was tracking you. Welcome back, Darklings. Today we're hunting down one of Brazil's oldest, strangest, and most misunderstood legends. A creature from indigenous tradition that existed long before European colonizers arrived. A being whose most famous feature, those impossible backward feet, has been explained away as myth, as metaphor, as mistaken identity. But what if I told you there's a reason those feet face the wrong way? A reason rooted not in fantasy, but in survival. A reason that reaches back thousands of years into indigenous wisdom, into the brutal logic of the hunt, and into a cosmology where backward means forward and death walks among the living. What if I told you the Curupira's backward feet are the key to understanding how folklore becomes a weapon, how stories protect forests, and how an entire culture embedded its deepest ecological knowledge into a single, unforgettable image? This is the story of the Curupira. And once you understand why his feet face backward, you'll never look at a footprint the same way again. Let's begin with what you think you know. In modern Brazilian folklore, the Curupira appears as a small figure, child-sized in some tellings, standing no taller than a young child, perhaps a meter at most. In other versions, he's described as a dwarf, compact and powerful, despite his diminutive stature. His most striking feature? Hair the color of flames, bright orange or red, wild and untamed, standing out against the green darkness of the forest like a torch in the night. Some say it's actual fire, flickering and smoking atop his head, crackling with heat that can be felt from meters away. Others describe it simply as hair so vibrant, so impossibly red, that it seems to burn, each strand catching light even in the deepest forest shadow. His skin varies dramatically by region, reflecting the diversity of the indigenous cultures that maintain this legend. In some Amazon stories, he's dark-skinned, the color of rich earth or dark bark, blending seamlessly with the forest shadows when he chooses to hide. In other tellings, particularly from coastal regions, his skin is described as green, actually green like moss or new leaves, as if he's part plant himself. Some accounts describe it as black, not the black of human skin, but the black of deep jungle shade, of places where sunlight has never penetrated. An unnatural darkness that hurts to look at directly. But every version, from the Amazon to the Atlantic forest, from Sao Paulo to Pará, agrees on one detail. His feet point backward, not twisted or broken, not deformed or injured. simply reversed, as if his heels are where his toes should be, and his toes face the direction he came from. When he walks forward, his footprints lead backward. When he runs, the tracks suggest retreat. When he flees, the evidence shows pursuit. It's not a handicap. It's a superpower, perhaps the most effective superpower any forest guardian could possess. Because anyone trying to track the Curupira, anyone following those prints pressed into soft jungle soil, finds themselves walking straight toward him while believing they're following him away. They pursue their own doom, thinking they're closing in on prey. The forest itself seems to collaborate with this deception. Paths that should lead away, instead, circle back. Clearings that should provide orientation only deepen confusion. Hours of pursuit end with the hunter recognizing a tree he passed 3 times before, realizing with growing horror that he's been walking in circles, that the footprints he's been following for half a day have led him nowhere, or worse, have led him exactly where the Curupira wanted him to go. The physical appearance varies in regional accounts, each community adding details that reflect local ecological knowledge. In some Amazon versions, particularly those from the Tupi people of Para State, the Curupira rides a collared peccary, a wild pig-like animal native to South American forests. This detail isn't random decoration. Peccaries are crucial to forest ecology, dispersing seeds, rooting through soil, creating microhabitats that support other species. By depicting the Curupira riding a peccary, the legend connects him directly to the forest's natural processes, making him not just a guardian, but an active participant in the ecosystem's health. Other versions describe him creating glowing footprints, trails of phosphorescence that lure curious hunters deeper into dangerous territory. These luminescent marks seem magical in the stories, though it's worth noting that bioluminescent fungi do grow in rainforest conditions, raising the possibility that the myth may encode observations of actual natural phenomena. His voice is another consistent feature. The Curupira doesn't speak human language in most stories. Instead, he emits a high-pitched whistle, a sound described as piercing, disorienting, maddening. Hunters report hearing it from all directions simultaneously, unable to pinpoint its source, the sound seeming to come from inside their own skulls. Some describe it as rhythmic, almost like music but wrong somehow. Notes that don't quite fit together, a melody that makes thought difficult and movement clumsy. Others say it sounds like wind through bamboo, or like the cry of an animal that doesn't exist, or like human voices speaking backward, words reversed into gibberish that nonetheless conveys clear menace. This whistle serves multiple purposes in the stories. Sometimes it's a warning, the Curupira announcing his presence, giving the intruder one chance to turn back before more serious consequences follow. Other times, it's a lure, drawing hunters toward danger, making them follow the sound deeper and deeper until they're hopelessly lost. And sometimes, it's simply torment, a sound that strips away courage and rationality, leaving hunters cowering and confused, easy prey for the jungle's other hazards. The Curupira doesn't live in villages or cities. He belongs to the forest, specifically the deep forest, far from human settlements. According to indigenous accounts collected over centuries, he inhabits the densest, oldest parts of the Brazilian rainforest, the Atlantic forest, the heart of the Amazon, places where sunlight barely penetrates and the trees have stood for hundreds of years. He's not a solitary hermit. Stories describe him with a family, a wife and children living in hollow trees, moving through the forest like ghosts, leaving only those backward tracks as proof they exist at all. His behavior is consistent across regions. The Curupira protects. Specifically, he protects animals, trees, and the forest itself from those who would take more than they need. He's not opposed to hunting. Indigenous people hunted for millennia, and the Curupira never stopped them. What enrages him is greed. The hunter who kills pregnant animals, the logger who cuts living trees, the poacher who hunts for sport or profit rather than survival. These are the Curupira's enemies, and his revenge is legendary. His methods vary. Sometimes he confuses. Hunters following animal tracks suddenly find themselves lost, walking in circles, the forest transformed into an incomprehensible maze. They might walk for days and emerge exactly where they started, hungry and exhausted, their quarry long gone. Other times he uses sound, a high-pitched whistle that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that burrows into the skull and makes thought impossible. Hunters describe it as maddening, a noise that makes you want to drop your weapon and run. And sometimes the whistle isn't a deterrent. Sometimes it's a lure, calling hunters deeper into places they shouldn't go. In more violent stories, the Curupira doesn't just confuse, he attacks. Tales from the Amazon describe hunters found dead, their bodies showing signs of being chased through the forest for hours, dying from exhaustion, or falling into rivers or ravines while fleeing something they couldn't see. Others tell of hunters who simply vanished, their tracks ending abruptly, as if they were lifted into the air. The forest takes them, people say, and everyone knows what that means. The Curupira took them, but he's not purely malevolent. Stories also describe his mercy. A hunter who enters the forest with respect, who takes only what his family needs, who thanks the forest for its gifts, this hunter has nothing to fear. Some accounts even describe the Curupira as helpful to those who honor the old ways. Crops protected from drought, families guided safely through dangerous territory, the forest itself opening paths for those the Curupira judges worthy. He's not a demon, he's a guardian. And like all guardians, he's terrifying to those he guards against. The Curupira appears throughout Brazilian culture. Children's books feature him as an environmental hero, teaching kids to respect nature. July 17th, Brazil's National Forest Protection Day, is also known as Forest Protector Day, specifically honoring the Curupira. In 2025, Brazil chose him as the official mascot for COP30, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, a symbolic recognition that this ancient forest spirit represents something the modern world desperately needs to remember. But the question remains, why backward feet? Why not claws? Why not fangs or wings or any of the other terrifying features mythology offers? Why this one specific, strange, unforgettable detail? To answer that, we need to go back, not to modern Brazil, but to the moment this legend first entered written history. May 30th, 1560. The coast of São Vicente, in what is now São Paulo State. A Jesuit priest named José de Anchieta, newly arrived from Portugal, sits in the mission compound writing a letter. He's 26 years old, devoted to converting the indigenous Tupi people to Christianity, and intensely curious about their beliefs. In his letter, written in Portuguese and destined for his superiors back in Europe, He describes something the natives fear more than anything else. More than wild animals. More than enemy tribes. More than the Portuguese themselves. They call it Curupira. Anchieta's letter represents the first written documentation of the legend, making the Curupira the earliest recorded figure in Brazilian folklore. He describes how the indigenous people revere and fear this entity, how they make offerings to avoid its attacks, how it dominates their relationship with the forest. He calls it a devil, using the Christian framework he knows, but his description makes clear the natives don't see it that way. To them, the Curupira isn't evil. It's natural, necessary, a force as fundamental as rain or fire. The Jesuits who followed Anchieta documented more. Father Fernão Cardam, writing a few decades later, notes that the indigenous people fear the Curupira above all devils but craft no idols of it, suggesting it exists in a different category than their gods or spirits. It's not worshipped. It's acknowledged, respected, avoided. In 1641, the explorer Cristóbal de Acunha mentions a tribe called the Mutayu, described as having feet that face backward, known as great craftsmen of stone axes. It's unclear whether this describes an actual physical trait, a misunderstanding of cultural practices, or the legend itself being reported as if it were about real people. Some scholars have interpreted this reference as evidence that the Curupira myth may have originated from, or been influenced by, actual tactical practices, where indigenous warriors wore sandals backward to confuse enemies. Others see it as the legend bleeding into colonial reports, where European observers struggled to distinguish between spiritual beliefs and physical descriptions. We'll return to that possibility shortly. Throughout the colonial period, European writers struggled to classify what they were hearing. In 1663, Father Simão de Vasconcelos records the native names for forest spirits: Anhanga, Jurupari, Curupari. He glosses Curupira as a nuomen mentis, perhaps meaning spirit of thoughts, suggesting even the early colonizers recognized this wasn't simply a monster story, but something more complex, something touching on consciousness and psychology and the space between the human and the wild. What's remarkable about these early accounts is their consistency. Despite being recorded by different people in different regions over more than a century, they all describe the same core features: small stature, red hair, backward feet, forest guardian, punisher of greed. The stability of the legend across time and space suggests something deeper than mere storytelling. This isn't a tale that evolved randomly. This is knowledge, preserved and transmitted with purpose. But who created this knowledge? Who first told the story of the backward feet? The answer lies in the Tupi-Guarani peoples, the indigenous nations who inhabited Brazil's coast and interior when Europeans arrived. The Tupi dominated the Atlantic coast, while the Guarani settled in what is now southern Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. Despite geographical separation, they shared linguistic roots and cultural frameworks, both descended from earlier Tupi-Guarani speaking groups that had migrated across South America for thousands of years. The name Curupira itself comes from the Tupi language, though its exact meaning is debated. One translation suggests Curupir, meaning covered in blisters, possibly referring to the creature's rough skin or the forest's harsh touch. Another interpretation breaks it into Kuramim, meaning boy or child, and Pira, meaning body, giving us child's body. Both translations fit. The Curupira is often described as child-sized, and both versions capture something liminal, something not quite fully formed or fully human, caught between categories. Tupi-Guarani cosmology provides crucial context. These cultures didn't separate the spiritual from the physical world in the way Europeans did. The forest wasn't just trees and animals. It was alive with spirits, with forces, with beings that existed alongside humans but operated according to different rules. The Tupi-Guarani believed in multiple souls, in the transformation of human into animal and back again, in the forest as a space of constant negotiation between the visible and invisible realms. And here's where it gets fascinating. In Guarani mythology, there's a figure named Japeusa, the third son of the first human couple created by the god Tupá. Japeusa was, from birth, a liar, a thief, and a trickster. He did everything backward, confusing people to take advantage of them. Eventually, he committed suicide by drowning. But death wasn't the end. He was resurrected as a crab. And since then, all crabs are cursed to walk backward, just as Japeusa did in life. Think about that parallel. A trickster who walks backward, a connection between backward movement and deception, between reversed footsteps and the punishment for transgression. The Curupira and Japeusa share more than just backward motion. They both exist in the liminal space between human and other. Both use confusion as a weapon. Both represent consequences for those who break natural or social laws. The similarities have led some folklorists to suggest they might be variations of the same archetype, the backward walker who embodies the forest's ability to reverse human expectations, to turn the hunter into the hunted, to make what seems forward actually be retreat. Whether they share a common origin or developed independently, both figures encode similar wisdom about the dangers of deception and the importance of respecting natural order. The Tupi-Guarani shamans, the powerful religious figures who mediated between humans and the spirit world, would have understood the Curupira not as a creature, but as a teaching. Shamanism in Amazonian cultures isn't about worshiping gods. It's about navigation, about traveling between worlds, about maintaining the delicate balance between human needs and forest survival. The shaman enters altered states, induced by plants like ayahuasca, and journeys into realms where human rules don't apply, where animals speak and trees have intentions and the dead walk among the living. In these spaces, backward becomes forward. What appears dangerous is actually safe. What seems like death is actually transformation. The Curupira fits naturally into this shamanic worldview. He's a being who exists at the boundary, his backward feet potentially marking him as someone who moves between worlds, someone who understands both the human perspective and the forest's deeper logic. When he tricks a hunter, he's not being cruel. He's teaching. The hunter who finds himself lost, who realizes the tracks led him in circles, who sits exhausted and terrified in the jungle night, this hunter learns something essential. The forest is not his to command. The forest has its own rules, its own protectors, its own intelligence. And humans who forget this die. Now here's where we need to talk about the practical explanation for those backward feet. Because there's a theory proposed by the Brazilian historian Sergio Buarque de Holanda in his 1957 book, Caminhos e Fronteiras, that strips away all the mythology and reveals something remarkable underneath. Holanda argued that the Curupira myth, and specifically the backward feet, originated from an actual indigenous tactical practice. He suggested that rainforest people, particularly those engaged in warfare or trying to evade enemies, would wear shoes or sandals backward. They would literally reverse their footwear so that when they walked north, their tracks appeared to point south. When they fled, their prints suggested pursuit. When they advanced, the evidence indicated retreat. Think about what this means. In the dense Amazon, tracking is everything. You can't see more than a few meters ahead. The canopy blocks aerial views. Sound is unreliable in the thick vegetation. Visual tracking of footprints and broken branches is often the only way to follow someone through the forest. And if you're an indigenous warrior trying to escape Portuguese slavers or rival tribal groups, the ability to confuse your pursuers isn't just useful, it's life-saving. Holanda pointed to colonial accounts of the Mutayu tribe, described as having backward feet and being master craftsmen of stone axes. He suggested these weren't people born with reversed feet. They were people who'd mastered the tactical use of backward footwear. And over time, as stories traveled and mixed with spiritual beliefs about forest guardians, the practical technique transformed into the mythological Curupira. This explanation is brilliant because it doesn't diminish the myth, it deepens it. The Curupira isn't just fantasy. He's the crystallization of actual survival wisdom, encoded in story form so it can be passed down, remembered, and applied. The backward feet aren't random. They're mnemonic, a way of teaching the lesson. In the forest, things are not what they seem. The obvious path is often the wrong one. What looks like escape might be entrapment. Trust your knowledge, not your assumptions. Consider the indigenous hunting practices documented by modern anthropologists. Tracking animals requires reading the forest like a text. A broken twig indicates passage, and its angle shows direction. Footprints reveal weight, speed, and how recently something moved through the area. Scat shows diet and health. Hair caught on branches identifies species. Expert trackers can follow an animal for days, reading signs invisible to untrained eyes. Now imagine you're an indigenous hunter. You know the forest intimately. You know which animals move where, which paths they prefer, which water sources they visit, and you also know that other hunters share this knowledge. Competition for game is fierce. So how do you protect your hunting grounds? How do you keep rival groups from tracking you to your most productive areas? You leave false trails. You break branches in misleading directions. You create confusion. And if you're really clever, you wear your sandals backward, so anyone following you walks into an ambush or wastes days heading the wrong direction while you circle back to your village with the kill. The Curupira legend takes this tactical wisdom and elevates it to cosmic importance. The backward feet aren't just a trick. They're a statement about the forest itself. The forest is not passive. It's not neutral. It actively protects itself from those who would harm it. And it does so by confusing the greedy, by making the exploiter's own cleverness work against them. The hunter who thinks he's good enough to track anything, he's exactly the one the forest will lead astray. The logger who's certain he knows the shortest path to the oldest trees, he'll find himself walking in circles until his supplies run out and he's forced to retreat. Pride becomes the mechanism of defeat. This is indigenous ecological wisdom at its most sophisticated. The Curupira myth doesn't just protect the forest by making people afraid to hunt there. It protects the forest by teaching a deeper lesson about sustainable harvesting. Take only what you need. Respect the prey. Thank the forest. Because if you don't, if you become greedy, if you start to see the forest as a resource to be exploited rather than a community to be negotiated with, then the forest itself will turn against you. Your own tracking skills will betray you. Your confidence will become your death. And here's the crucial part. This works. Anthropological studies of indigenous territories consistently show that areas where traditional hunting practices and beliefs remain strong have dramatically better forest conservation outcomes than areas where these traditions have been abandoned. Indigenous territories in the Brazilian Amazon contain some of the most intact forest remaining, with deforestation rates far lower than surrounding areas. The stories work. The Curupira, whether you believe in him literally or understand him as metaphor, actually protects the forest. Modern tracking studies bear this out. Researchers studying indigenous hunting communities in Guyana found that the sign method, using indirect evidence like footprints and scat rather than direct sightings, provided more accurate animal population data than modern camera traps. Local hunters, trained in traditional tracking, could read the forest's story in ways that technology couldn't match. And they knew something else: how to confuse other trackers, how to protect areas from overhunting by making them seem empty or already depleted. The backward feet aren't just myth, they're methodology. But there's another layer, one that moves beyond practical tactics into the realm of cosmology and the spirit world. Because in indigenous Amazonian belief systems, backward isn't just backward, it's otherworldly. It marks beings who exist between life and death, between human and animal, between this world and the next. Shamanic traditions throughout the Amazon describe the spirit world as inverted or reversed compared to the human world. What's up here is down there. What's forward here is backward there. When shamans enter trance states, often through the use of plants like ayahuasca, they describe traveling to realms where normal, spatial, and temporal rules dissolve. In these spaces, they might encounter beings who appear backward or upside down, not as a deformity, but as a marker of their supernatural nature. Within this cosmological framework, the Curupira's backward feet can be understood as marking him as a liminal being, someone who straddles the boundary between the physical forest and the forest's spiritual dimension. He's not entirely of this world. He moves through both realms simultaneously, which would explain why he can appear and disappear, why he seems to know hunters' intentions before they act, why he can create illusions that confound human perception. His feet point to where he's been in the spiritual sense, while his body moves through physical space, creating a deliberate contradiction that signals his otherworldly nature. This connects to broader Tupi-Guarani beliefs about multiple souls and the complexity of being. According to documented accounts, these cultures believed humans possessed more than one soul. One soul was the animal soul, governing instinct and temperament, mortal and earthbound. Another soul was spiritual, granted by the divine, capable of thought and nobility, destined to return to the gods after death, while the animal soul wandered the earth as a potentially dangerous ghost. A person wasn't a unified self, but a complex assemblage of different vital forces, each with its own destiny. The Curupira, with his backward feet, might represent this multiplicity embodied in a single being. He's simultaneously child and ancient, human-shaped but animal in habit, protective and vengeful, visible and invisible. His backward feet symbolize his refusal to fit into single categories, his existence across boundaries that humans try to keep separate. Consider the forest itself in this cosmology. It's not a place. It's a community of beings, human and non-human, visible and invisible, all negotiating survival and relationship. Trees have spirits, rivers have owners. Animals are people who wear different bodies. The forest thrums with intention, with consciousness distributed across every living thing. And in this framework, hunting isn't simply killing, it's diplomacy. Indigenous hunters and Amazonian cultures often perform rituals before and after hunting, acknowledging the animal's sacrifice, thanking its spirit, ensuring no waste occurs. They might address the forest directly, explaining their need, promising respect. This isn't superstition. It's the practical application of a worldview that recognizes human survival depends on maintaining good relations with the non-human world. Break that relationship and you break the ecosystem that sustains you. The Curupira enforces this relationship. He's the forest's diplomat, its negotiator, its enforcer of the old agreements. When a hunter takes more than needed or kills without gratitude, the Curupira responds not out of spite, but as the forest's representative, maintaining the balance that keeps both forest and humans alive. His backward feet remind humans that in the forest, you're always being watched, always leaving traces, always accountable to forces beyond your control. This takes on new meaning when we consider death and the afterlife in indigenous belief. Many Amazonian cultures describe the land of the dead as inverted or reversed. To reach it, souls must travel backward or upside down, entering a realm where normal rules no longer apply. Given this cosmological framework, the Curupira's backward feet could suggest a deeper role, one that extends beyond forest guardian into the realm of death itself. Some scholars have interpreted this as marking him as a potential psychopomp, a guide between worlds, someone who helps navigate the boundary between life and death. There's a darker interpretation buried in some versions of the legend. What if the Curupira doesn't just punish greedy hunters? What if he collects them? The stories tell us he lives with his family in hollow trees, but they don't specify who that family is. Could those who die in the forest, lost and confused, their tracks leading nowhere, become part of his household? It's a grim reading, one not explicitly stated in the documented legends, but it aligns with the broader cosmological framework these cultures maintained. In this interpretation, death in the forest wouldn't be an ending, but a transformation. You become part of what you exploited, serve forever the system you tried to cheat. Now let's zoom out and see if the Curupira is unique or part of a global pattern. Turns out, beings with backward feet appear in folklore worldwide, each serving similar functions in their respective cultures. In South Asia and Central Asia, there's the Pichal Peri, described as a churel, a vengeful spirit who appears as a woman with long hair covering her face and feet pointing backward. Like the Curupira, the backward feet confuse pursuers and mark her as otherworldly. She roams mountains, particularly in India and Pakistan, and is associated with protecting remote areas from intruders. The Dominican Republic has La Chiguapa, a small woman with dark skin, long flowing hair, and famously backward feet. She lives in mountains and forests, luring men with her beauty and voice, often to their doom. Like the Curupira, her backward feet make her impossible to track, allowing her to vanish into wilderness that she protects from exploitation. Ancient texts describe the Abariman, a legendary tribe said to live in the Himalayan mountains with feet turned backward. Despite this apparent handicap, They were described as incredibly fast runners. The ancient writer Pliny the Elder documented them as real people, though they were likely mythological, representing the dangerous, remote mountain regions that travelers feared. Even in ancient India, the churel, female ghosts or spirits, are recognized by their backward feet. They can take human form, but are always betrayed by their reversed feet, marking them as beings from the spirit world rather than the living. The pattern is clear. Across cultures, from Brazil to the Himalayas to the Dominican Republic, backward feet serve as shorthand for beings who guard wilderness, who exist between worlds, who confuse and frighten those who would intrude on sacred or dangerous territory. It's a cross-cultural symbol that taps into something deep in human psychology. The fear of being tracked versus the fear of following a false trail. The terror of realizing you're not the predator, but the prey. These beings also share other traits. They're almost always associated with specific landscapes, forests, mountains, remote wilderness. They protect these spaces from human exploitation. They use deception and confusion rather than direct violence as their primary weapons. They're not purely evil, but respond to human behavior, punishing disrespect, while sometimes helping those who approach nature properly. And they're almost always liminal, existing at boundaries between human civilization and wild nature, between life and death, between this world and other worlds. The Curupira fits perfectly into this global pattern while adding uniquely Brazilian elements. The connection to specific indigenous tribes and languages, the detailed ecological wisdom about Amazon hunting practices, the sophisticated cosmological framework of Tupi-Guarani shamanism. He's both universal and particular, embodying human truths about wilderness and respect while growing directly from the soil and stories of Brazil's indigenous peoples. So we've traced the legend from its first written documentation in 1560 through its indigenous origins in Tupi-Guarani culture into its practical basis in actual tracking deception tactics, and through its spiritual dimensions as a marker of boundary crossing and otherworldly nature. Now let's ask, what does the Curupira mean today? In 2025, Brazil chose the Curupira as the official mascot for COP30, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, hosted in Belém, in the Amazon. This wasn't a random choice. It was a statement. The Curupira represents indigenous ecological knowledge, the understanding that forests aren't resources to be extracted, but communities to be protected. That sustainable human life depends on maintaining balance with the natural world. The Brazilian government, by selecting the Curupira, was acknowledging something modern environmentalism often misses. Indigenous people didn't preserve the Amazon by accident. They preserved it through active management guided by cultural frameworks that made forest protection not just practical, but sacred. The stories worked. The beliefs worked. The fear of the Curupira, whether literal or metaphorical, kept generations of people from overexploiting the land they depended on. Studies consistently show that indigenous territories have dramatically lower deforestation rates than other Amazon areas. Even compared to government-protected conservation zones, indigenous lands show better outcomes. Why? Because indigenous communities have cultural and practical knowledge about forest management that took thousands of years to develop. They know which plants can be harvested and which must be left alone. They know hunting patterns that maintain animal populations. They know fire management that prevents catastrophic burns while promoting forest health. And crucially, They have stories that encode this knowledge in memorable, emotional, culturally reinforced formats. The Curupira isn't a biology textbook. He's better than a biology textbook. He's a story that children hear from elders, that hunters remember in the forest, that becomes part of identity and worldview. You don't forget the Curupira. You can't. Those backward feet lodge in your imagination and stay there, a permanent reminder that the forest watches, judges, and protects itself. This matters more than ever, and the statistics tell a grim story. Brazil is facing massive deforestation pressure from multiple fronts: industrial agriculture, particularly soy and cattle ranching, illegal logging operations that strip ancient hardwoods for international markets, and gold mining that poisons entire river systems. Indigenous territories, once protected by law and isolation, are under constant assault from land grabbers, illegal miners called garimpeiros, and timber operations that see protected forest as profit waiting to be extracted. Since 2013, deforestation inside indigenous territories has increased by 129%. The number bears repeating, 129%. And the rate accelerated dramatically during the Bolsonaro administration between 2019 and 2022, when environmental protections were systematically dismantled. Land that had stood intact for thousands of years, protected by indigenous stewardship, and encoded in legends like the Curupira, was cleared at unprecedented rates. Gold mining has proven particularly devastating, and not just because of the physical destruction. The mercury used to separate gold from sediment contaminates rivers, accumulates in fish, and enters human bodies where it causes neurological damage. Studies in Yanomami territory found that 56% of women and children had mercury levels above World Health Organization safety limits. Children born in these communities face developmental delays, tremors, loss of motor coordination. The forest that sustained these people for millennia is being transformed into a toxic wasteland, and with it goes not just biodiversity, but entire cultures, languages, knowledge systems that took thousands of years to develop. The Curupira legend speaks directly to this crisis, because what these miners and loggers are doing isn't just environmental destruction in an abstract sense. It's the violation of reciprocal relationships, the breaking of agreements that maintained balance for generations. They're taking everything, giving nothing, showing no respect, operating with the pure logic of extraction that sees the forest as dead material rather than living community. If the Curupira were real in a literal sense, these operations would be exactly what he exists to punish. And in a metaphorical sense, maybe he is punishing them. Because communities that destroy the forests that sustain them don't thrive. They create their own doom, even if it arrives more slowly than a forest spirit's revenge. Indigenous leaders have become increasingly vocal about connecting traditional ecological knowledge to modern conservation efforts. They're not asking the outside world to believe literally in forest spirits, though many indigenous people do. They're asking for recognition that the cosmological frameworks that produced legends like the Curupira also produced effective conservation practices. The stories were never just stories. They were educational technology, ways of encoding complex ecological relationships in formats that could be remembered and transmitted across generations without writing. Consider what the Curupira legend actually teaches. Don't take more than you need. Shows hunters which behaviors are sustainable and which lead to resource depletion. Don't kill pregnant animals or young offspring. Maintains breeding populations that ensure long-term availability of game. Don't cut living trees unnecessarily. Preserves forest structure and all the species that depend on it. Respect the forest as a living system with its own agency. Creates psychological framework for treating nature as partner rather than resource. These aren't superstitions. They're practical conservation biology, developed through millennia of trial and error, encoded in a format that's memorable, emotionally resonant, and culturally reinforced. Organizations working on Amazon conservation increasingly recognize this. The Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, and indigenous rights groups collaborate on programs that support traditional land management while defending territories from invasion. They're not trying to freeze indigenous cultures in time or treat them as museum exhibits. They're recognizing that indigenous people have always been active managers of their environments, using techniques that modern science is only beginning to understand and appreciate. For instance, indigenous fire management. For decades, environmentalists saw any human-caused fire as destructive, trying to eliminate indigenous burning practices. Recent research shows this was catastrophic ignorance. Indigenous people use fire strategically, creating patchwork burns that promote certain plant species, create habitat edges that support wildlife diversity, and prevent the accumulation of fuel that leads to uncontrollable megafires. Suppressing indigenous burning didn't protect the forest. It made it more vulnerable to massive fires that destroy everything. The indigenous people knew this. They'd been practicing sustainable fire management for thousands of years. The Curupira legend, with its emphasis on understanding forest dynamics and respecting natural cycles, encodes this kind of deep ecological knowledge. Similarly, indigenous understanding of plant medicine has led to countless pharmaceutical discoveries. Quinine from cinchona bark, used to treat malaria. Curare, used as muscle relaxant in surgery. Countless other compounds now used in modern medicine, all discovered by indigenous people through generations of careful experimentation and observation. When pharmaceutical companies bioprospect in the Amazon, extracting plant samples and indigenous knowledge without compensation, they're practicing exactly the kind of exploitative extraction that the Curupira legend warns against. Take without respect, take more than needed. Refuse to maintain reciprocal relationships, and consequences follow. The Curupira's selection as 30-cop mascot represents a cultural shift, an acknowledgement at the international level that indigenous knowledge isn't primitive but sophisticated, that the stories these cultures developed aren't entertainment, but essential wisdom for species survival. Brazil's current government, under President Lula, has made forest protection and indigenous rights a priority after years of assault during the previous administration. Choosing the Curupira sends a message. The forest has guardians. Those guardians are indigenous people who've protected these lands for millennia, using cultural frameworks that modern conservation science should learn from rather than dismiss. But symbols are only valuable if backed by action. Indigenous territories need legal protection, enforcement against invaders, support for self-governance, and traditional management practices. Indigenous people need title to their lands, not contingent on government whim, but secured permanently. They need resources to monitor their territories, remove illegal miners and loggers, restore damaged areas. They need their cultural practices and knowledge systems respected and integrated into national and international conservation strategies. The Curupira legend, offers a framework for understanding what's being lost. It's not just trees. It's not just biodiversity, though God knows we're hemorrhaging species at terrifying rates. What's being lost is a whole way of knowing and being in relationship with the natural world, a cosmology that understood forests as alive, as conscious, as deserving respect and negotiation rather than exploitation and destruction. Indigenous leaders and environmental activists are working to preserve both the forest and the knowledge systems that protected it. Organizations are documenting traditional ecological wisdom, supporting indigenous land rights, and pushing back against the extractive industries that treat the Amazon as an empty warehouse rather than a living community. The Curupira has become a symbol of this resistance, a reminder that the forest has always had defenders, that indigenous people developed sophisticated tools, both practical and spiritual, for maintaining the balance between human needs and ecological sustainability. The backward feet take on new resonance in this context. They represent looking back, remembering, valuing the knowledge of ancestors over the ideology of endless growth and extraction. They represent confusion of those who think nature exists to serve human profit. They represent the reversal of perspective needed to survive the climate crisis, recognizing that humans aren't masters of the earth, but one species among many, dependent on maintaining relationships with the rest of the living world. Scientists increasingly recognize that indigenous knowledge isn't primitive or outdated. It's sophisticated ecological science developed through millennia of careful observation and experimentation. Indigenous fire management practices, once dismissed as destructive, are now understood as essential for forest health. Indigenous understanding of plant medicine has led to numerous pharmaceutical discoveries. Indigenous cosmologies that treat nature as alive and deserving respect are now echoed in systems ecology and conservation biology. The Curupira, then, isn't just a relic of the past. He's a model for the future. His backward feet point not just to confuse hunters, but to remind us to look back, to learn from what worked, to recognize that the indigenous people who've sustained the Amazon for thousands of years know something we desperately need to relearn. July 17th, Forest Protection Day in Brazil, celebrates the Curupira specifically. It's a national acknowledgement that this legend matters, that the stories indigenous people told weren't superstition, but were, and are active tools for environmental protection. Schools teach children about the Curupira as an environmental hero. Conservation organizations use his image in campaigns. The Foundation Brasileira para Conservação da Natureza adopted the Curupira as its official symbol back in 1958, recognizing that this figure embodied what they were trying to achieve: protection of Brazil's natural heritage. But the Curupira also warns us, because the legend isn't just about protection, it's about consequences. Those who disrespect the forest get lost, get confused, get taken, and we're seeing that play out globally. Climate change is our confused wandering, our realization that the footprints we've been following, the path of industrial extraction and endless growth, doesn't lead where we thought. We're the lost hunters, circling back to the same crises, exhausted and running out of time, finally understanding that we were tracking ourselves toward disaster. The Curupira's message is stark. The forest will defend itself. If not through a literal guardian spirit, then through the brutal logic of ecological collapse. Destroy the Amazon, and you destroy the rainfall patterns that feed South American agriculture. You release billions of tons of stored carbon. You collapse indigenous communities and cultures, You extinguish species before we even document them. The forest doesn't need mystical revenge. Its destruction is revenge enough, visited upon everyone, exploiter and innocent alike. So, what do the backward feet really mean? At the practical level, they represent ingenious tactical deception, the wisdom of indigenous people, who understood that survival meant confusing enemies and protecting knowledge of the land. At the spiritual level, they mark the Curupira as a boundary crosser, a being who exists between worlds, who enforces the delicate balance between human needs and forest survival. At the mythological level, they create an unforgettable symbol that lodges in memory and shapes behavior, making people think twice before over-exploiting the forest. But at the deepest level, the backward feet represent a reversal of perspective. They force us to acknowledge that our forward march of progress might actually be backward, that our technological cleverness might be leading us in circles, that the indigenous wisdom we dismissed as primitive might be the knowledge we need to survive. The feet point backward not as a defect, but as a correction, a way of saying, look where you came from. Remember what worked. The path forward might require walking in a direction that seems, to modern eyes, like retreat. The Curupira exists where the practical meets the spiritual, where tactical knowledge becomes cosmological truth, where a detail as simple as reversed feet encodes thousands of years of hard-won ecological wisdom. He's a reminder that stories aren't just entertainment. They're technology, tools for survival passed through generations, adapted to changing circumstances, but retaining their essential message. Respect the forest. Take only what you need. Remember that you're not alone and not in charge. And maybe, in an age of climate catastrophe and collapsing ecosystems, maybe we need the Curupira more than ever. Not as a literal spirit, though indigenous people might disagree with my skepticism, but as a framework for thinking differently about our relationship with the natural world. We need to reverse our footsteps, to confuse the logic that says nature exists for human exploitation, to remember that the forest has always protected itself and those who protect it. If this journey into the forest of forgotten folklore intrigued you, consider becoming part of the tribe by hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications. We've got more dark corners of history to illuminate, more familiar stories to trace back to their strange origins. Next time, we're diving into something that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about a beloved fairy tale. Until then, remember, not all who wander are lost, but those who follow the wrong tracks definitely are.